The day the council chose to spill human blood, they signed their own end. The chair under me was not built for a human body that I knew that the second I sat down. It was too wide, too flat, and bent at an angle no human spine would ever choose. The people who designed the Grand Conclave had planned for 46 species. They had not planned for USO. I adjusted. I planted both feet on the floor, straightened my back as best I could, and looked ahead. The chamber was huge. It rose around me like the inside of a broken shell. Pale light from the dying star outside passed through clear wall panels and filled the room with a cold, washed-out glow. The ceiling was so high that thin mist gathered near the top. Inside that mist, soft, glowing creatures floated slowly like living lamps that I had studied this place my whole life. Every human diplomat had. The Grand Conclave of the Interstellar Accord was the strongest lawmaking body in known space. 47 species. 400 years without interruption. Worlds had risen or fallen because of decisions made in this room. And I, Commander Solis, had one seat here. Not because they wanted me. That part was clear that I was here because the Accord's own founding charter said that any species capable of faster-than-light travel and planetary-level government had to be given provisional delegate status. Humanity had qualified 11 years ago. They delayed our seat for 9 of those years. Then Ambassador Henry Cole had finally taken it. He lasted 14 months. The Accord called his death a navigation accident. I had read Henry's final reports before leaving Earth. In his last entry, he wrote that he could feel the walls closing in. I had not understood that line until I arrived here. Now I did. The session had already started when the door opened for me. I was technically on time. In this chamber, I'd already learned. On time meant late. The other delegates had been seated for a while. Some were speaking quietly in groups. Some were trading data through private screens. Some were building alliances in the space before the official meeting even began. When I entered, the room did not fall silent. IT shifted. I felt it the way you feel a pressure drop before a storm. Eyes followed me to my seat, measured me, judged me, and dismissed me before I had even sat down. I opened my console and pulled up the agenda. Item 1, Review of Provisional Membership Classifications. Item 2, Resource Survey Authorization for Outer Rim Systems. Item 3, Fiscal Allocation across Accord territories. I had been briefed on all of them. Item 1 was the real fight, that a provisional membership review meant the Council could vote to extend, reduce, or remove the standing of any species. Not yet granted full membership. Humanity had been provisional for 11 years. That was long, but not unheard of. The Yell had been provisional for 22 years before they gained full status. The difference was simple. The Yell had friends. They had powerful allies among the founding species. They had something the old powers wanted badly enough to make room for them. Humanity had been trying to offer things for 11 years. Technology sharing, access routes, mineral rights on empty moons in return, we got delays, investigations, audits, and polite speeches about how promising our species was. Then I scrolled down and found the line that had not been in my briefing package. Proposed reclassification, human-controlled systems to unguided territory status, pending full review. I read it once. Then again. Then a third time, slowly. Unguided territory was the Accord's legal term for systems that were either empty or occupied by species not recognized as sovereign powers. In plain language, it meant this. No one owns this. So it can be taken. That category had been used 17 times in the last century to approve resource extraction. In 15 of those cases, there had been smaller civilizations present. Reviews in those cases lasted anywhere from 2 to 8 years. By the time the reviews were finished, the resources were already gone. I sat very still. Then I looked up and found the one face I had been warned about the most. Councillor Vithsar of the Dominari. He sat across the chamber in the raised section reserved for founding species. The Dominari were one of the oldest powers in the Accord, and Vithsar had held his seat longer than most humans had been alive. He was tall even while seated, with the dark gray-green skin that Dominari elders developed with age. He wore no medals, no symbols, no title marks. He did not need them. Everyone in the room knew exactly who he was, And what he could do, he was already watching me when I found him, but he did not look away. Neither did I. The session was called to order. The moderating delegate, a six-limbed official from the Teresi Collective, announced the agenda in 4 languages at once. The chamber settled. I opened a blank document on my console and began writing the argument I planned to make when Item 1 was called. I had prepared for 3 weeks. I had read every major accord legal precedent from the last 140 years. I had studied every successful appeal against provisional reclassification. Every night, I had spoken with the human legal team on Earth through tight beam channels, refining every sentence, every citation, every point of order. I was not just going to argue that humanity deserved to keep its status, that I was going to argue that the provisional system itself was being used as a political weapon. And more than that, I was going to argue that this sub-item was illegal. Accord Charter, Section 9, Paragraph 4. Any sovereignty review affecting a currently recognized species required 60 standard days of notice. We had received notice 4 days ago. I finished my notes, straightened my jacket, and waited. 2 items passed before mine was called. Why then the session had been running for 3 hours. The light in the room had not changed. The mist near the ceiling had grown thicker. My back already hurt from the chair. When the moderator announced Item 1 and its attached sub-item, I pressed the request to speak indicator before the chime had even finished. There was a pause. In human procedure, a request like that would be acknowledged within seconds. Here, the silence stretched almost a full minute. I kept my hand flat on the console and waited. Across the chamber, Vithsar had not moved at last. The moderator recognized my request. I stood. My objection is procedural, I said. My voice was steady. The sub-item concerning the reclassification of human-controlled systems must be ruled out of order. It violates Charter Section 9, Paragraph 4. Notice was provided 4 standard days ago. The required minimum is 60. I have the relevant citations prepared for the record. The chamber went quiet. Not the quiet of careful thought, the quiet of people who had expected this and already decided how they would answer it. The moderator turned slightly toward the founding species section. Vithsar unfolded his hands. The chair recognizes the human delegate's procedural concern, he said. His voice was calm, smooth, almost gentle. However, provisional delegates do not have standing to raise points of order in matters concerning their own classification. This is established in Procedural Rule 41, subsection C. The item will proceed. I stayed standing. Rule 41, subsection C applies to disputes between full member species, I said. Humanity is a provisional member. That distinction is addressed in the supplemental guidelines issued in Accord Year 312, which explicitly grant provisional members the right to challenge procedural violations affecting their status. This pause lasted longer. Several delegates checked their screens. Some leaned toward their neighbors and spoke in low voices. I stayed where I was, eyes forward, hands calm. The moderator said that the chamber would need to consult the procedural subcommittee before ruling. Vithsar said consultation was unnecessary. Then he requested an immediate vote on whether the item should proceed. The vote took 40 seconds, 31 in favor, 14 abstentions, 1 against. I sat down slowly. My face stayed calm. My jaw did not on my console. I typed 1 sentence. They're not interested in the law. They are interested in the outcome. I sent that note, along with my full argument and the vote record, to the human legal team on Earth in the next transmission window. Then the session moved on. The Council voted to begin a full sovereignty review of human-controlled systems. With an open-ended timeline, pending availability from the Accord Resource Assessment Division, I voted against that too. I was still the only one. The session ended 2 hours later. Delegates left in groups, talking, sharing, planning. I gathered my files and walked alone back to the human delegation suite on the lowest level of the conclave. Near the service halls, that MY briefing packet had described it as conveniently located. It was not that IT was where they put species they did not want seen. I locked the door behind me, sat at the small desk, and began preparing for the next day. They had made their opening move. I had been taking notes on it for 3 weeks. Now, it was my turn. The next morning, I was in my seat before anyone else arrived. I had slept less than 3 hours. The rest of the night, I spent reading every transcript I could access involving provisional species sovereignty reviews. I was not looking for legal patterns anymore. I had those already dot. I was looking for behavior. I wanted to know how they apply pressure, how they lined up support, which delegates always move together. And most importantly, at what point the targeted species usually stopped fighting. I found the answer. IT was always the same moment. The target stopped fighting when the room made resistance itself look improper. That was the method. Not open cruelty, not open force, just the cold, steady pressure of a powerful institution deciding you were the problem for objecting. Henry Cole had called it the walls closing in. Now I knew what he meant. He had been describing the moment he started to believe them. I was not going to believe them. The session opened. 2 minor items passed. Then Vithsar requested the floor for a matter not listed on the official agenda. This was allowed under a court procedure for founding delegates under special circumstances. The phrase was vague. In practice, it meant that if you were old enough and powerful enough, you could bring forward almost anything you wanted. Vithsar rose and announced that, in light of the previous day's procedural challenge from the human delegate, the Dominari bloc was submitting a formal motion to review and revise the speaking rights of provisional delegates. I felt the room change. Not sharply. Just enough. Like standing on a floor and realizing it was not solid stone after all, that I opened a fresh document and began recording. Motion number. Time. Requesting delegate. Date. Then I typed another sentence. They're trying to remove my ability to object before the review even begins. That I requested the floor immediately. The moderator looked to Vithsar. Vithsar made the smallest signal with one hand. The moderator recognized me. That I stood. For the record, I said, this motion would alter the procedural rights of the provisional member whose sovereignty review is already underway. Changing the rules during an active review, specifically to reduce the ability of the reviewed party to participate, is addressed directly in the Accord's foundational fairness doctrine, adopted in year 41. I request that this motion be referred to the Ethics Subcommittee before any vote is taken. Silence. Then, from the Dominari section, one of Vithsar's secondary delegates said something quietly in his own language. I did not catch all of it. I caught enough. MY translation feed rendered it in my ear. The small voice objects again. That a few delegates nearby made sounds that the translation system marked as amusement. I kept my eyes on the moderator. My request stands for the record, I said. The moderator noted it. Then the motion went to vote. 28 in favor, 16 abstentions, 1 against. Mine. The revised rules would take effect at the start of the following session. Under the new system, provisional delegates could speak only during approved response windows and only on matters directly tied to their membership status. We can no longer raise points of order. We can no longer request the floor outside designated periods. We could no longer challenge procedure during live proceedings. That I in one vote. They had turned me into a spectator in my own hearing. That I sat down and finished my notes. Then I did something I had planned the night before. I opened the encrypted communication module on my secondary device. Not the standard one. The hidden one. Henry Cole had concealed it inside the base of the desk in the human suite. I had found on my second day here and told no one that I drafted a message, but did not send it. YET.IT was addressed to a relay route that would pass through 4 carrier systems before reaching Earth. Inside it included everything from the last 2 days. The violation of notice requirements, the vote record, the motion limiting my speech, every public statement Vithsar had made, every ruling the moderator had given, and my direct assessment of what I believed was happening to the bottom. I added a single line. They're not planning to let this end in our favor. I need you to be ready. I did not explain what ready meant. The people receiving it would understand that we had spent 11 years learning exactly what that word meant. The session continued through the afternoon. 3 more items came and went. None concerned humanity directly. I stayed quiet. I watched everything. Who sat together? Who left together during breaks? Which species voted as blocks? Which ones split? Which ones abstained every time? Which was a kind of choice of its WNT. The end of the session. As the chamber began to empty, Vithsar passed by my section. He did not stop. He did not turn toward me. But as he walked past, he spoke just loud enough for me to hear. The review will conclude within 30 days, he said. I suggest the human delegate use that time to prepare a graceful transition statement. I looked up at him. I suggest, I said, that the counselor review the full text of Charter Section 9, because I am not finished yet. He kept walking to I gather my files, returned to the human suite, locked the door, and sent a message. Then I opened a new document and began writing for the next day. According to Vithsar, I had 29 days left and I intended to use every one of them. The human suite had a narrow window that looked out over the conclave's docking ring. Most mornings before the session began, I stood there and watched the traffic move. Cargo haulers from half a dozen species. Diplomatique transport. Observer ships from military factions that were officially present only to monitor. Officially, they were not supposed to arrive armed. Most of them arrived armed out, I noticed that on my second day, and said nothing that IT was the kind of detail that explained the whole accord better than any speech ever could. There was the version written in the charter, and there was the version people actually lived by. That morning session was closed. Closed sessions were not broadcast. They were not publicly logged. In theory, they existed for sensitive negotiations. In practice, they were where the real decisions were made, away from the record anyone outside the chamber could see. Whether I had the right to attend had been under dispute since the day I arrived. Provisional delegates had historically been allowed into any session directly affecting their status. The new speaking rules had limited my right to speak, but they had not clearly removed my right to be present. It was a gap in the language. I had found it on the fourth night of reading through the revised rules line by line. Since then, I had built an argument around it and kept it ready. When I reached the closed session entrance, the guard did not ask for my argument. He simply stepped aside that I walked in. The chamber looked different in closed session. The same curved walls, the same pale, filtered light. But the seats had been pulled into a much tighter circle, and the lower lighting made the room feel smaller, almost compressed, as if the walls had leaned inward. There were fewer people present. All the founding species had representation. A handful of mid-tier full members, several technical advisors, and me that I took my seat and opened my console. Then I pulled up the statement I had prepared that I had spent 17 nights building IT that IT was clean, precise, stronger than anything I had ever written. It documented every major human contribution to Accord space since first contact. It laid out the procedural violations in the current review. It argued that the move to classify human-controlled systems as unguided territory was not only illegal under the Charter, but a direct betrayal of the principles the Accord claimed to protect. That IT was, I believe, the best legal argument any human had ever placed before this body, that I was about to learn that it did not matter. Vithsar opened the session himself. That was unusual. Closed sessions were normally led by a neutral moderator. The fact that he was running this one told me everything I needed to know about how seriously they were taking the idea of fairness. He explained the purpose of the session in 4 sharp sentences. The Accord was reviewing the sovereignty classification of human-controlled systems. The purpose of this session was to receive the provisional member's final statement before the review committee issued its recommendation. The human delegate would be given one designated response period of 10 minutes. Then the committee would deliberate 10 minutes. For 11 years of humanity's existence in Accord space, for the standing of an entire civilization, that I pressed the indicator. The system confirmed that my response window had begun. That I stood. Then I spoke. That I did not rush. I did not raise my voice. I made every point exactly the way I had planned it. I named the procedural violations clearly. I cited the Charter. I laid out humanity's contribution record. I asked the committee, formally and for the record, to remove the Dominari delegation from deliberation because of conflict of interest. Then I named Henry Cole, and the room went still. That I said his name anyway. That I referenced the circumstances of his death. I referenced the fact that the Accord's own review board had declined to fully investigate. I put that into the record too. Then I finished out. I still had 2 minutes left in my speaking period. That I sat down and placed both hands flat on the console. Vithsar waited just long enough to make the silence feel deliberate. Then he said the committee would take my statement under advisement and move directly into deliberation. One of his secondary delegates spoke first. then a delegate from the Ravathi, a full-member species with deep trade ties to the Dominari, then one from the Kashari Federation, who had spent multiple sessions abstaining on every human issue and had apparently now decided they had an opinion. All of them were saying the same thing. They just used different words. Humanity was not ready. The review process had been proper. The proposed reclassification was protective, not hostile. The Accord had a responsibility to manage frontier territory with care. And O1 addressed Henry Cole. And O1 answered even one of my legal citations that I sat there and documented every word. And as I listened, something cold settled in my chest. Not despair, that I want to be exact about that, IT was not despair, IT was not defeat, IT was clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when you have spent days telling yourself that reason still matters, and then finally see, clearly and completely, that the people across from you are not interested in reason at all. They were never going to decide in humanity's favor. Not because our case was weak, not because we had failed to prepare, not because the law was unclear, because the decision had been made before I entered the room. The procedure was theater, the 10 minutes were theater, the 11 years were theater. They had given us a seat, so they could claim they had given us a seat. And when the moment came, they were going to take whatever they wanted and point to the process afterward and call it lawful. Vithsar was speaking again, that he was summarizing what he called the committee's emerging consensus. His language was careful and polished and administrative, but beneath all of it was one simple fact. They believed humanity did not have the power to stop them at S.O. They saw no reason to stop themselves. That I lifted my console and began writing. Not a legal reply. Not a procedural challenge, but a message. Same relay route as before. Same encryption. Same destination that I wrote 4 words. They drew first blood. Then I sent it before Vithsar finished speaking. After that, I sat very still and listened to the rest of the session. I kept documenting everything, but I said nothing else. That I had already said everything that needed to be said in that room. Now I was speaking through another channel. The session ended. I walked back to the human suite and sat at the desk by the narrow window. Outside, ships moved quietly around the docking ring. The dying star cast its pale light across metal hulls and station glass. That I thought about Henry Cole. He had written that the walls were closing in. The difference between Henry and me was not courage. I want that clear. Henry Cole was one of the bravest people I have ever known, even if I only knew him through his reports, his recordings, and the trail of evidence he left behind. The difference was belief. Henry had come here, believing the Accord could still be reasoned with. That belief had been worn down over 14 months until there was almost nothing left of it. I had not arrived with that belief. That I had come to build a record, and now that record was complete. What happened next was not my choice. That IT never had been done. My job had been to be present, to document, to represent, and to communicate. The people receiving my messages would do their job next. That I made coffee from the small supply I had brought from Earth. The Conclave's provisioning system did not stock human food. That, too, was a message. Everything here was a message. I sat by the window with the coffee in my hand and watched the docking ring until the light shifted. Somewhere beyond that glass, beyond the dying star, beyond the cold dark between systems, 2,200 ships were waiting for a forward message. WY now. They had received it. The reply came back within 6 hours. Not through my console. Not through Henry's hidden relay. IT came the way only one kind of message ever really comes. Through every channel at once. Every monitored frequency. Every system the Accord was listening to. IT was broadcast in all 47 recognized Accord languages, and 17 more. I was in the corridor outside the human suite when the Conclave alert systems started registering the incoming signal. 2 technical staff ran past me toward a monitoring station. The lights in the corridor shifted from normal white to pale amber. Unknown contact protocol. I turned, went back in the suite, sat at the desk, and listened. The message from Earth was simple. IT did not threaten. IT did not be e.g. IT stated 3 facts. First, the United Earth Council had reviewed the official records submitted by its delegate and found the Accord's conduct to be in clear violation of the Accord's own founding charter. Second, as of that transmission, humanity was formally withdrawing from Interstellar Accord, effective immediately. Third, there are currently 2,200 human vessels positioned at the outer boundary of Accord claim space. They were not there to negotiate. They were there because humanity had learned something during the past 11 years, and now the Accord was about to learn it too. I in the corridor outside my room. I heard running. Then more running. I finished my coffee, checked my personal documentation one last time, and reached for my jacket. The Conclave security team arrived 4 minutes later. They were polite. They informed me that for my own safety, given the developing situation, I was being escorted to a secure holding area until the council could assess events. That I did not argue. I went with them. I looked calm because I was calm. I had been waiting for this moment for 3 weeks. I had been trained for it long before that. The people who had sent me here knew me well enough to know I would stay calm. They had counted on it. The secure holding area was on an upper floor of the conclave, in a much better section than the human suite. Larger room, better furniture, bigger window. From that window, I could see most of the docking ring as I watched 3 Dominari ships undocked in rapid sequence. .2 Turi observer craft left after them. The ring was moving now with the kind of urgency that told you something important. The conclave was no longer certain it was safe. I sat by the window and began writing the account you were reading that I wrote for 6 hours. On the 4th hour, a Dominari official came to the room and told me, in formal language, that the council was prepared to discuss a settlement. Humanity could keep provisional status. The unguided territory proposal could be suspended. A joint committee could be formed to review the procedural concerns I had raised. That I told him I was not authorized to negotiate anything, that he should speak to Earth. That he left. That on the 5th hour, another visitor came. This one was not Dominari. He was from the Teresi collective. The same Teresi who had said almost nothing during the 3 weeks I had been here. He sat across from me, quiet for a moment, then spoke in careful common tongue. That he said the Teresi had voted against the unguided territory proposal during internal discussion and had been overruled by the Dominari coalition. That he said it was not an excuse, only context. That I thanked him for telling me. Then he asked what humanity was going to do. I told him the truth, that I did not know the exact next steps, but I knew this much. Whatever humanity did, it would not be what the council expected, because they had spent 11 years underestimating us. And when you are underestimated for that long, you get time. Time to build, time to prepare, time to create things no one bothers looking for, because no one thinks you are capable of creating them. He held my gaze for a moment, then nodded once and left. That on the 6th hour, the conclave's external sensors picked up a human vessel entering immediate orbital range. Not one of the 2,200 single fast diplomatic transport broadcasting a standard extraction code. At the same time, my communicator came back online. It had been blocked since the closed session. A voice came through. Lieutenant Commander Petra Walsh, she said. I had not heard her voice in person since the morning she drove me to the transport station back on Earth. She did not waste time. I'm at the secondary docking approach, she said. You have 3 minutes. I picked up my bag. IT had been packed since my first night in the conclave. That I moved to the door of the holding suite and found the guard gone. I did not know whether they had been pulled away by orders or by panic. IT did not matter. I stepped into the corridor and moved fast. I took the service route. I had memorized it on day 1 because service routes are always faster, always less watched. And because Henry Cole had included their layout in his reports before he died. That I reached the secondary docking approach with 40 seconds left. Petra Walsh was waiting at the airlock in a flight suit, helmet tucked under one arm. She looked me over once, checked the bag, and nodded. Good, she said. Let's go. The transport detached from the docking clamp before the conclave's automated systems had fully processed our departure. Yes, we cleared the station's orbital edge, and the dying star dropped behind us. Petra handed me a situation report. I read it while we accelerated toward the transition point. The Accord's reaction to Earth's withdrawal had split within 3 hours. 12 species had opened direct communication with Earth within the first 90 minutes. 9 had gone completely silent. The Dominari had moved their home fleet to the boundary of their primary system and issued a formal denunciation of humanity's actions. and the 2,200 human vessels had shifted from boundary position to intercept posture along the most likely Dominari advance corridor. I read that line twice. Then I kept reading. 12 hours after Earth's broadcast, the Accord's own security division had opened a new internal inquiry into Ambassador Henry Cole's death. The case had been reopened because new documentation had been submitted through legal channels. 7 non-Dominari full member species had joined the request. That had never happened before. Vithsar had made no public statement. That I closed the report and looked out through the forward viewport at the stars ahead of us. Away from the dying star, they were sharp and steady. For a while, Petra said nothing. Then she asked, "How are you holding up?" I thought about the answer. Then I gave her the honest one. "I'm tired," I said. The chair in that chamber was wrong for a human body, and I haven't slept properly in 3 weeks. She said, "Nothing to S.O." I kept going. I watched 47 species sit in a room while someone explained, in legal language, how to take everything humanity built. I watched most of them decide that was acceptable. That was true, too. Then I took a breath and said the part that mattered most. But underneath all of that, I'm certain we did the right thing. And I'm certain what comes next is going to prove it. She glanced at me. "How can you be sure?" Because I had watched them vote. Because I had seen 31 species choose the easy direction. Because I had seen them decide, again and again, that humanity was too small, too new, too provisional, and too unimportant to matter. They had made that choice 11 years ago, and they had kept making it every time we came to them with evidence, patience, law, and restraint. S.O. I told Petra the truth. Because every bully in history makes the same mistake, I said. They think the person they've been pushing around will never push back. She looked out at the stars again. Then she said quietly, 2,200 ships. I nodded once. 2,200 ships. We flew in silence after that. The flagship was called the Hartwell.IT, had been named after Admiral Grace Hartwell. The officer who had written half of the tactical doctrine of the fleet was now built on. She had died 6 years earlier, before the underlayer program produced anything she could actually step aboard. But she had known it was coming. And the people who built the first ship made sure it carried her name. I came aboard through a forward access corridor and was met by Captain Oliver Crane. He had led the operational side of the underlayer program for 4 years. When he shook my hand, his grip told me what his face did not need to doubt. He had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. He took me straight to the bridge. The bridge of the Hartwell was nothing like the council chamber. IT was smaller. Practical. Efficient. Every surface carried information. Every person at every station was doing something specific. No drifting mist. No cold, filtered light. No ceremony. Just clear illumination. The low hum of a ship at readiness. And beyond the hull, 2,200 human vessels holding formation in the dark. That I stopped at the main viewport and looked at them. They had been built inside asteroid belts. That was the simplest way to explain it. Across 17 systems, humanity had identified 43 asteroid fields that were either too remote, too difficult, or too full of raw material for the Accord's survey divisions to treat as high priority. Under the cover of mining infrastructure, over 9 years, we had built ships there, quietly, system by system. The Accord had never seen them because the Accord had never thought to look. The Dominari believed we still depended on their trade routes for certain alloys, propulsion parts, and guidance cores. We had 11 years ago, but we did not anymore. The underlayer program had built its own supply network inside its own hidden chain, and the Accord had not tracked a single major component. They had spent years measuring humanity by what we used to need. They never noticed what we had learned to make. I turned from the viewport and took my place at the communication station. Captain Crane stood beside me. I opened a channel to every Accord member species at once. The signal was picked up in 4 seconds. Even the species that had gone silent connected. Nobody was pretending not to listen now. When I spoke, I did not begin with greetings. I began with facts, and I told them what had happened. Not as accusation, not as anger, as documented record. That I gave them dates, session numbers, vote counts, procedural notices. I laid out the violation of the notification period. I described the motion that had stripped away my right to object while the review was still active. I named Henry Cole. I named the inquiry that had now reopened around his death. I reminded them that humanity had been submitting documentation regarding Henry's death for 2 years and had repeatedly been told it did not meet the threshold for review. I did not speak loudly, but I did not need to. Facts can be louder than shouting when everyone listening already knows they are true. Then I told them what humanity wanted, not territory, not trade compensation, not resources, and not an apology from a system that had behaved the way the Accord had behaved would have meant. Nothing that we wanted 3 things. First, Counselor Vithsar placed into the custody of the new joint inquiry to face formal review under terms humanity's own legal counsel would help define. Second, all sovereignty actions against human-controlled systems dismissed permanently and with prejudice, meaning they could not be reopened later under new wording or new procedure. Third, every species present in that closed session, everyone that had watched a human delegate be procedurally silenced and then voted to continue anyway, would place into the public record a formal statement of what they had done and why. Not private, public, not a note buried in internal files, but a permanent statement attached to their diplomatic history. Words cost some species more than resources ever do. I paused after that. Then I said humanity was giving the Accord 24 hours. The channel stayed open. Across different feeds, I could hear confusion, private discussions, sharp voices and languages I only partly understood. The sound was the same everywhere. Recalculation. Captain Crane leaned toward me slightly and said, in a calm voice, that the Dominari fleet had changed course. IT was no longer holding its boundary, that IT was moving. That I asked one question. Toward where? He answered without hesitation. Toward us. I looked back out at the stars. They were steady. I thought about what I had told Petra on the transport. About what happens when someone who has been pushed long enough finally pushes back. I had said it because I believed it. But there is a difference between believing something and standing in front of it while it happens. The Dominari fleet was old, powerful, experienced. They had been fighting wars before humanity had writing. What they had never done was face a species that had spent 9 years building strength inside places they had never thought to search while pretending to remain small. I looked at Captain Crane. Hold position, I said. Do not move first. He nodded. The Dominari fleet kept coming. On the open channel, 3 species began broadcasting directly to the Dominari delegation, asking them to stand down. The Teresi spoke. So did a Yell delegate who had found very little to say during the weeks I had spent in the conclave. The Dominari did not stop. They entered targeting range. Then they began locking weapons. I turned to Crane. He looked back at me. He was waiting for one word. I thought of Henry Cole. I thought of the closed session. The 10-minute statement. The 31 votes. The translated whisper in my ear. The small voice objects again. I gave the order. Answer them. The Hartwell's tactical officer opened a response channel on the Dominari command frequency and transmitted our full targeting solution. Not as a threat. AS information. This is what we see. This is what we have. This is what happens next if you continue. The Dominari fleet stopped. IT held there in the dark for one long moment. Then, slowly, it began to reverse course. The open channel changed instantly. The same species that had been quiet for weeks were now speaking very quickly. Several of them started routing communications directly to Earth, not to me, not to the Hartwell, not through my channel. That was exactly what I had expected, and exactly what I wanted. I was not the negotiator here. I was the witness, the messenger, the keeper of the record. The actual bargaining was now happening where it should have been happening all along. I stood from the communication station and walked back to the main viewport. Outside, the underlayer fleet held its line. 2002. 100 ships unmarked in O special diplomatic banner. No provisional symbol. No request for recognition. They were not here asking to be treated as equals. They were here as equals. That was the difference. An officer at a nearby station reported that 14 species had now opened priority communications with Earth. Another reported that the joint inquiry into Henry Cole's death had formally expanded, that a third reported that the unguided territory subitem had been withdrawn by its own sponsors, that required a specific threshold of support to reverse. Apparently, the votes had become very easy to find once the balance of pressure changed. I stayed at the viewport for a long time. Eventually, Captain Crane came to stand beside me. He said the first replies to humanity's terms were coming in. Point 12 species had indicated preliminary acceptance. Point 2 wanted clarification on the public record requirement. Point 3 remained silent. The Dominari had not answered at all. That's fine, I said. We gave them 24 hours. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked the question I had already been asking myself. What do you think Vithsar does now? I kept looking at the stars when I answered. Whatever he does, I said, it will be because he finally understands something he never understood in that chamber. Crane waited. I continued. When the Accord looked at humanity, they saw a small, young, provisional species still learning how the galaxy worked. They saw patient arguments, legal briefs, requests for speaking time, objections filed through proper channels, and they decided patience meant weakness. I turned and looked at him then. They never asked the real question. He said, nothing. Oh, I answered it myself. Why was a species as capable as humanity willing to stay patient for 11 years? The bridge was quiet. Then I said the part that mattered. Not because we were weak. I looked back out at the fleet, because we were busy. Captain Crane was silent for a few seconds. Then he said, softly, 2,200 ships. I nodded once, and that is only what we showed them. He looked at me then, really looked. Then he followed my eyes back to the stars, somewhere inside the Accord's communication network, which our signals teams have been quietly listening to for 7 years. The oldest powers in known space were having the kind of conversation powerful people only have when they realize they have misunderstood something important. I hope the conversation was loud. The 24 hours did not pass quietly. The Dominari waited 19 of them out. In the end, it was not the fleet that broke them. It was the inquiry. Within 19 hours, the internal Accord investigation had gathered enough supporting evidence from 7 cooperating species to request that Vithsar's diplomatic immunity be suspended pending review. Point 4 of those 7 species had been in the closed session. Point 4 had voted the way they had voted. And now were helping investigate the man who had led them there. That was the thing about bullies. The moment the cost changes, the alliances change. 2.8 hour 19. Vithsar submitted himself to inquiry custody. His statement was brief, cold, careful, and free of admission. IT did not matter. IT did not need to admit anything. The record already existed, and now the record was public. The 3 silent species answered in the last 5 hours. Point 1 accepted all 3 of our terms. Point 1 accepted 2 and asked for mediation on the third. Point 1 sent a message not to me, not to Captain Crane, not even Earth's legal command. IT addressed humanity itself. At IT was 4 paragraphs long. IT said they had known what was happening. IT said they had done nothing. IT said they were sorry. And it said they hoped humanity understood the difference between conviction and complicity. I read it 3 times. Then I set it down. I asked myself whether I forgave them. The answer was simple. Forgiveness was for later. Forgiveness was for people with enough peace to sit still and think clearly about what they were willing to release. At AT that moment, there was still too much moving, too much unfinished. The official Accord response arrived at hour 20-2. IT accepted all 3 terms. IT declared the unguided territory action permanently withdrawn. IT acknowledged procedural failures in the sovereignty review. IT committed the Accord to a full charter review. And attached to the statement, as a formal appendix, was the public record humanity had demanded. A list of every species present in that closed session, the vote each had cast, and a short statement of their position at the time. 31 species had voted to continue a sovereignty review they knew had been compromised. Now their names were attached to that decision in a document that would stay in the Accord's public archive for as long as the Accord existed. I printed a copy. I still keep it. What happened next with humanity's actual place in the Accord was more complicated. Technically, we had withdrawn. That withdrawal was now on the record, and the charter did not contain a clean path for readmission after formal withdrawal. No species had ever done it before. I found that quietly satisfying. The negotiations that followed lasted weeks. They were detailed, exhausting, and handled by more than 60 human legal scholars working in rotating shifts around the clock. I was part of them, but I was no longer the center of them. That was right. My job had been to go there, sit in the chair that was not made for a human body, make the argument, record the answer, see clearly what the accord truly was beneath its language, and when the time came to send the message forward. After 41 days, the negotiations produced something new, a category of status that had never existed before. IT was called Founding Equivalent Membership. Granted. Every full member species had to agree unanimously. IT had never been offered to any species outside the original founding 7. When the vote was held, it passed with 43 in favor, 0.3 abstentions. All three belonged to Dominari. Aligned species whose major trade routes still passed through systems where the underlayer fleet remained nearby. I made note of that. Without comment, humanity took its new seat on the first day of the next full session. The chair at that station was different from the one in the provisional section. IT had been built to human specifications. Petra Walsh had sent those specifications to the Conclave Facilities Division 4 days before the session. Petra had always understood the value of details. I sat down, and for the first time since arriving, the chair fit. The session opened. I pressed my speak indicator with everyone else, and this time the system answered me exactly the way it answered every other delegate in the chamber. No special window, no limited response period, no silence meant to remind me where I stood. Just recognition, equal and immediate. I noticed that more than I expected to. The agenda began. Motions were introduced. Reports were read. Delegates argued over language, timing, trade policy, border review, and committee assignments. It was ordinary government work. And for the first time, I was part of it in the way I'd always been supposed to be. When I spoke, no one could cut me off by pointing to my status. When I objected, it entered the record. When I voted, my vote carried the same weight as every other vote in the room. That was the difference, not comfort, not ceremony, not words that wait to the end of the session. While the chamber began to empty, I stayed in my chair for a moment and did not move. I thought about Henry. Cold, I think about him often. I have spoken at 2 ceremonies held in his name since the inquiry began, and I intend to keep going to them for as long as I can. What happened to Henry was not an accident. It was not a misunderstanding, and it was not justice. The inquiry was still active. That had been written into the terms that IT would remain active until it reached a real answer. I had made sure of that. I sat there and thought about the years between first contact and this day, about all the human representatives who had come before me, about every argument they had made and every answer they had been denied. They had not failed. That mattered. They had built a record. Every one of them had added something to it. A report, a vote count, a transcript, a warning, a detail someone else had wanted ignored. Piece by piece, they had built the thing that eventually made it impossible for anyone to say they did not know what had happened. That was not failure. That was foundation. I thought about the question Petra had asked me on the transport. How are you certain? I had answered her honestly, but there had been another part of the answer I had never spoken out loud. Maybe because it sounds too simple when you say it directly. Maybe because simple things are often the hardest to understand fully. The part one had not said was this. Humanity has been in impossible situations before. We have been in situations that looked like the end of everything. The end of cities, the end of governments, the end of whole futures people thought were permanent. And somehow, again and again, we have come through them. Not because we were impossible to kill, not because we were smarter than everyone else, not because we're better. We come through because we do not know how to stop completely. That we keep going, even when we are exhausted, even when the argument is not working, even when the room has already decided what answer it wants, even when the chair does not fit and the light feels wrong and the people across from us have chosen the outcome before we even speak. That we still keep going, that we make the argument, that we document the response, that we send the message, that we build the ships in the dark. That I do not think that makes us unique. I think every species that survives long enough develops some version of that trait, but humanity's version is specific. You can see it if you know what to look for. That IT is stubborn in a way that sometimes looks irrational right up until the moment it wins. Vsar had looked at me in the corridor and told me to prepare a graceful transition statement. He had spent decades reading species. He had watched provisional members come and go. He had seen the same pattern so many times that he had stopped, asking whether this case might be different. That was his real mistake. Not cruelty, not even arrogance, exactly that IT was familiarity, the kind of mistake powerful people make when they have one the same way for too long. When pattern recognition becomes comfort, when experience turns into blindness, he thought he already knew how this story ended, that he thought humanity was another version of a case he had handled before, that we gave him something new to recognize, that I stood up at last from the chair that fit, gathered my documents, and looked once across the chamber before leaving. For weeks, I had entered that room as the small voice, the tolerated delegate, the procedural inconvenience. Now I was leaving it as a representative of a species no one in that room would ever misread in quite the same way again. And that mattered too, because institutions remember force, but they remember corrected assumptions even longer that I walked toward the exit at a normal pace. Carrying my files under one, and O1 stopped me, and O1 redirected me. N01 suggested I take a side corridor or wait for a designated escort or remain within some approved zone for provisional access. Those rules are gone now, or maybe more accurately, they had only ever really existed for us. I reached the main doors and paused for the smallest moment before stepping through. Then I went out into the corridor. The corridor outside the chamber was busy. Delegates from 17 species moved past in different directions, speaking in quick bursts, checking their screens, carrying reports, calling aides, arguing quietly about things that would become next week's agenda. It was the ordinary sound of a government still trying to look permanent after being forced to change that I took the main corridor, not the service route. That mattered to me more than I expected. For weeks I had moved through this place like someone being tolerated, directed downward, out of sight, kept near the edges, sent through the routes meant for staff, support crews, and species the conclave did not particularly want visible. Now I walked where everyone else walked. Point 3 delegates from 3 different species nodded as I passed point 1 of them, speaking in careful common tongue, said that they were looking forward to my presentation to the Charter Review Subcommittee next week, that I told them I was looking forward to it too. And I meant it. That was the strange thing. After everything that had happened, after the votes and the silence and the closed session and the fleet and the 24-hour deadline, what came next was not glory. That IT was work. Long, careful, difficult work. Reviewing language, rewriting procedures, closing loopholes that had existed for centuries because they had always been useful to someone important. Making sure no other species could be cornered the way we had been cornered. Making sure no one could be turned into a spectator in their own hearing ever again. That was the part people liked to forget once the dramatic moments were over. But that part mattered just as much. Maybe more that a fleet can force a pause, that a record can force accountability, but only work changes the structure enough to matter later. That I reached the elevator and took it to the upper observation level. There was a long window there that looked out over the docking ring. I had stood there once before under very different conditions, watching ships I did not trust and a station that did not want us. Now I stood there again. Outside, the traffic looked ordinary. Cargo haulers, passenger transports, courier ships, that a few military observer vessels that were still not technically supposed to be armed. Some things changed faster than others. None of the ships in view were ours. The underlayer fleet was farther out now, still present, still watching. They would remain there for the foreseeable future. Presence is a language. For 11 years, the Accord had taught humanity that only certain languages were taken seriously. We had learned all of them. Law, procedure, documentation, economic leverage, logistics, and, when necessary, force held under discipline. That was a lesson they had forced on you. It was only fair that they had to live with the result. That Y communicator vibrated in my hand. It was Petra. Her message was short. Dinner tonight with the rest of the human staff? Found a provisioning service that finally stocks human food. Coffee is supposed to be decent. I read it once and felt for the first time in weeks. Something in me loosen. Not relaxed completely. Not yet, but loosened. I sent back a simple answer that I'll be there. Then I stayed at the window a little longer. I looked out at the stars beyond the docking ring. At the dark between ships. at the routes leading outward into systems that had once been names on legal documents and were now names on maps that everyone in the Accord would think about differently. Somewhere out there were the shipyards we had hidden, the stations we had built in silence, the supply chains the Dominari never noticed, the people who had spent 9 years doing patient, difficult, invisible work while other people in polished chambers kept telling us we were promising. That word had always irritated me. Promising that IT was what you called someone when you wanted credit for not taking them seriously yet. Humanity had been promising for 11 years. Then, in less than 24 hours, we had become expensive to ignore. There are species that believe history turns on grand speeches. There are species that believe it turns on battles. They are both wrong, at least most of the time. That is how species survive long struggles. Not through single heroes, through chains that be why refusing to let the work die when the worker does. The charter review took almost a year that I spent more hours in committee rooms than I care to count. There were subcommittees, redrafts, legal objections, translated clauses that meant one thing in one language and something dangerously different in another. There were species that wanted reform, but not too much reform. Species that agreed with every principle in private and resisted every sentence in public. Species that had suddenly become believers in transparency now that transparency was aimed at someone else. That I learned to recognize all of it. That I learned which smiles meant delay, which compliments meant resistance, which requests for clarification were real, and which were simply another way of hoping a meeting would run out of time. Humanity was not the only species in those rooms pushing. That mattered too. There were allies now. Real ones, not perfect, not brave in every moment, not clean-handed, but real. The Teresi were among them, S.O. were the L, once they decided that silence had become more dangerous than speech. Several smaller species were the most serious of all. They understood the stakes immediately because they had spent generations living close to the edge of systems where law was often something done to them rather than for them. That in the end, the reforms passed. Provisional delegates, where provisional status still applied, were granted protected speaking rights that could not be altered during an active review. All sovereignty challenges required transparent notice periods with public tracking. Closed sessions affecting member status had to produce sealed but reviewable transcripts accessible to an independent oversight body. And perhaps most importantly, any delegate-facing review or classification change could no longer be procedurally excluded from objection on the grounds that the issue concerned them directly. That had been the old trick that IT looked almost elegant written down. You are too involved to defend yourself. That I made sure that sentence died, that humanity's seat changed more than just the legal structure of the chamber, that IT changed the room itself, not all at once, not perfectly, but visibly. Species that had once accepted things as normal began asking more questions. Not because they had become morally pure, but because they had watched what happened when assumptions were pushed too far. They had watched one promising species leave the Accord, position a hidden fleet, tear open a buried case, force public admissions, and come back stronger than it had arrived. That leaves a mark. Power learns from pain too. I remained in the conclave longer than I originally expected. That was another thing nobody tells you about moments that sound historic when written later. They do not end cleanly. After the dramatic part is over, someone still has to show up next week. Someone still has to answer messages, revise language, attend working groups, and explain to 12 different delegations why founding equivalent does not mean founding, but renamed. I did that work. Some days I hated it. Most days I respected it. All days I understood why it mattered, because this was the other half of pushing back, not just making them stop, making them live with what stopping required. Months later, I passed the old provisional section during a recess and stopped for a moment. The chair I had first sat in was still there, too wide, too shallow, wrong in every way it had been on the day I arrived. I stood there looking at it for longer than I meant to. In aid passing nearby, asked if I needed anything. That I told them no, that I was just remembering, and I was remembering the first day. The pale light, the mist near the ceiling, the way the room shifted when I walked in. The first time I saw Vithsar watching me across the chamber. The first time I understood that no one there planned to treat law as law unless someone made it costly not to. I was remembering Henry, the hidden relay in the desk, the words they drew first blood on my console, the sound of Petra saying 2,200 ships like she was still measuring the size of what had already become real, that I was remembering the exact weight of the moment when clarity replaced hope. And I was remembering something else too, how easy it would be later, after enough time had passed, for people to retell the story in a cleaner shape. I'll make it sound inevitable. I'll make it sound as if humanity always knew exactly what would happen to us. If our victory had been obvious once we revealed the fleet, IT was not obvious, IT was not clean, that IT was not safe. There were a dozen points where it could have gone another way. Misread timing. Panic. A weapon discharged too early. A species deciding that wounded pride mattered more than survival. A frightened officer making the wrong choice in the wrong minute. We won because of preparation, yes, but also because disciplined people in critical moments did not lose control. That matters. Force without discipline is just another form of stupidity. Humanity did not survive that confrontation because we were the loudest. We survived it because, when the moment came, we were the most ready. I left the provisional section and returned to the main chamber. My new chair was waiting where it always waited now, built correctly, placed correctly, part of the room as if it had always been there. I sat down before the next item was called. The system recognized my presence, equal and immediate. That still meant something every time. That I suspect it always will. There are moments that change your sense of the future, and then there are moments that change your sense of the past. This had done both. After it was over, I understood not only where humanity was going, but what we had been all along. Not harmless, not naive, not weak, patient, busy, documenting, building, learning every language that power speaks, and waiting, not forever, just long enough to the end of one late session, after most of the chamber had emptied and the lights had shifted toward evening cycle. I sat alone for a minute and looked out across the curved rows of seats. That I thought about the phrase Vithsar had used in the corridor, a graceful transition statement. He had wanted humanity to prepare language for surrender. What he got instead was a permanent public record 31 species had. Their names attached to what they chose in that room. Humanity had its name attached to what it built in response. Neither record was going anywhere. That is the thing about records. People think they are passive. They're not. A record is memory with structure, and memory with structure becomes consequence. Why communicator buzzed again. Petra, making sure I had not forgotten dinner. That I smiled despite myself, gathered my files, and stood. Outside the chamber, the corridor was still full of movement. Voices in dozens of languages. Messengers, delegates, aides, translators, staff. The ordinary machinery of a galaxy trying to govern itself after being forced to notice one more truth than it had wanted. I took the main corridor again. I always took the main corridor now. That a delegate from a smaller frontier species fell in a step beside me for half a block of the hallway and asked whether I thought the revised oversight rules would actually hold in practice. I told them they would hold exactly as long as enough people insisted on enforcing them. They nodded like that was the answer they expected. Maybe it was. That is another thing adulthood teaches civilizations as surely as it teaches individuals. No rule protects itself. Someone always has to stay awake. By the time I reached the lift, the station had dimmed into evening mode. The light outside the observation windows had changed. The dying star still hung there beyond the glass, but it no longer looked cold to me. Or maybe I no longer looked at it the same way. I met the rest of the human staff in a dining room on the upper ring. The coffee was, as Petra had promised, decent. The food was almost convincing. Someone had persuaded the provisioning office that if humanity was now a founding equivalent member, the least the conclave could do was learn how to stock proper meal options. That small victory pleased Petra more than some of the larger diplomatic ones. She has always had a clear sense of what counts. We ate, we talked at one point someone asked me whether I thought the Accord had really changed. I thought about it before answering. Then I said the only honest thing. Yes, I said, but not enough to trust blindly. They all nodded. That was the right answer. Institutions do not become good because they are embarrassed once. They become better only when people keep pressure on the exact places where they used to fail. Humanity understood pressure now. We understood timing, we understood records, and we understood visibility. The underlayer fleet remained in position beyond major Accord routes for a long time after that. Not close enough to provoke panic. Not far enough to be forgotten that we were not hiding anymore. That was part of the point. The galaxy had wanted to classify us small, young, provisional, promising that we had answered with a different classification. Present. When dinner ended, I walked alone for a while before heading back to my quarters. I passed the long observation window one more time and stopped there with my hands behind my back, looking out over the docking ring and the stars beyond it. The traffic outside was ordinary now. Routine, predictable. That, too, meant something that meant the crisis had passed. Meant systems were still moving. Meant life, trade, law, and argument had all continued. People sometimes think victory feels like noise. Sometimes it feels like this instead, that a corridor, no one stops you, and a chair that fits out a vote that counts, that a meal shared by tired people who know exactly how close things came to breaking and are too disciplined to romanticize it. I stood at the glass for one last minute. Then I turned away and started walking toward whatever came next. Because that is the thing about humanity, that we always walk toward what comes next. Not because we are fearless, not because we're certain, not because we are special. Because movement is what we do when stopping would mean becoming the version of ourselves someone else already wrote down. We do not accept that version for long. And somewhere in the permanent public record of the Interstellar Accord, 31 species still had their names attached to what they chose. Humanity's name was attached to what we built. That record is not going anywhere.